The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 9 Coherence, Inner and Outer Alignment. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series, Volume 3, The Silencing Field, Return to Self, and Episode 9, Coherence, Inner and Outer Alignment. This is not an episode about becoming more consistent, more confident, or more certain. It is not about refining identity or strengthening conviction. It is about something quieter and far more stabilizing. The moment participation stops costing you. Coherence is often mistaken for strength, for clarity, for having it together. But coherence, as it appears here, is not a personality trait and not a belief system. It is a physiological condition in which your inner signal and your outer participation move at compatible speeds. Nothing heroic, nothing performative. Just alignment that holds. Until coherence is present, participation requires compensation. You translate yourself. You override the signal. You act before timing is ready. You explain to justify the gap between what you feel and what you do. Over time, this becomes so normal that fragmentation feels like maturity. Functioning becomes proof. Exhaustion becomes invisible. Volume 3 has been undoing that normalization step by step. Stillness interrupted compulsive motion. Sensation returned to the body as a signal. Orientation restored the place and context. Discernment separated the signal from the noise. Boundary returned the edge. Voice allowed expression without performance. Agency restored choice without urgency. Reciprocity made timing visible in contact. Now coherence asks a different question. Not how do I show up, but what happens when I no longer have to split to participate? Because most people are not incoherent by accident. They learned incoherence as a survival skill. They learn to fragment the signal to meet demand. They learn to act first and feel later. They learn to keep moving even when internal timing said stop. And they learn to call this responsibility. Coherence is not the opposite of that. It is the release of it. When coherence is absent, participation feels effortful even when things are going well. You may succeed, you may perform, you may be effective, but there is a background cost, a low-grade tension, a sense that you are slightly ahead of yourself or slightly behind, that your actions are not quite landing where your body is, that something has to be held together manually. This episode begins where that manual effort ends. Coherence is the condition in which you no longer need to argue with yourself to act. You do not have to persuade your body to keep up with your decisions or force your decisions to override your body. Action arises without internal debate because timing is aligned. This is not certainty. Certainty is cognitive. It can exist without coherence. People can be very certain while deeply fragmented. They can know exactly what they believe and still feel exhausted living it. Coherence is not knowing what to do. It does not have the right answer. It is the absence of internal contradiction during participation. That absence is felt first, not thought. When coherence appears, there is a distinct bodily signal. Breath moves without interruption. Posture supports without bracing. Attention stays present during action instead of splitting between doing and monitoring. There is less internal commentary, less self-surveillance, and less need to explain what you are doing to yourself while you do it. Participation becomes quieter. This quiet is often misread as disengagement by environments organized around speed. But it is not disengagement, it is efficiency of a different kind. Nervous system efficiency. The efficiency of not having to override the signal to meet demand. Coherence does not make you passive. It makes you precise. And precision here is not about correctness. It is about timing. When your internal rhythm and the rhythm of the environment are compatible, action lands cleanly. You speak when speech fits. You pause when pause fits. You move when movement fits. There is no lag and no rush. This is why coherence often feels like relief rather than achievement. You do not gain something new. You stop losing energy to fragmentation. Fragmentation is costly because it forces the nervous system to manage contradictions continuously. One part wants to slow down, another pushes forward. One part senses misalignment, another insists on performance. That internal negotiation burns cognitive and physiological resources. Over time, it produces fatigue that rest does not fix. Coherence reduces that load by aligning timing. The body no longer has to fight itself to participate. This is also why coherence cannot be installed through discipline or intention. You cannot decide your way into alignment. You can decide to override. You can decide to push. You can decide to perform. But coherence emerges only when participation no longer requires internal suppression. This is where reciprocity becomes the prerequisite rather than the solution. Without reciprocity, coherence collapses under contact. You may feel aligned alone, but as soon as you enter a field that collapses time, you fragment again to keep up. You speed up, you explain, you adapt. Coherence strains because the environment cannot hold your timing. Reciprocity revealed this. It showed you where timing could be shared and where it could not. It exposed the cost of participation that depends on urgency. Coherence asks what you do with that information. Coherence does not mean you withdraw from all misaligned environments. It means you no longer disappear inside them. You participate where possible without splitting, and you recognize where participation will cost you coherence. That recognition is not dramatic. It is felt as a subtle resistance to fragmentation. This is the return of the internal reference in motion. When coherence is present, internal reference does not need constant checking. You are not scanning for whether you are doing it right. You are not monitoring how you are perceived to maintain alignment. You are not correcting yourself mid-action. You trust timing because timing is no longer being forced. This trust is fragile at first. Many people mistake it for laziness or indifference because it lacks urgency. But urgency was never proof of care. It was proof of pressure. Coherence removes that pressure and reveals what participation actually feels like when it is sustainable. Sustainable does not mean easy. It means non-eroding. You can exert effort without fragmentation. You can face a challenge without splitting. You can hold responsibility without overriding the signal. Effort remains. Cost changes. This is why coherence is not the same as authenticity. Authenticity is often framed as expressing truth regardless of impact. Coherence is quieter. It is not about expression. It is about alignment between what moves inside you and what you do in the world. You can be authentic and incoherent. You can express yourself clearly while living out of time with yourself. Coherence requires more than truth. It requires timing compatibility. Language changes here too, but not yet in content. First, language loses urgency. You speak without having to convince yourself. You stop narrating your own actions internally. You do not need to explain your participation to make it real. This is the end of self-translation. Self-translation is one of the most exhausting hidden costs of modern life. Explaining to yourself why you are doing something that does not feel aligned. Justifying speed, rationalizing override. Promising yourself it will be worth it later. Coherence ends that loop not by solving it, but by making it unnecessary. When coherence is present, you recognize when participation fits and when it does not. You do not need a story. The body tells you through ease or friction that friction is not failure, it is a signal. This is why coherence is stabilizing rather than empowering. It does not inflate the self, it reduces internal conflict. As we move into this episode, the work is no longer about restoring capacities. Those have been returned. The work is about maintaining alignment while participating, not by controlling the environment, but by recognizing where timing matches and where it doesn't. This is the quiet discipline of phase 3, not optimization, not mastery. Discernment in motion. Coherence does not promise certainty. It promises the integrity of the signal during action. You may still not know what will happen. You may still face ambiguity, but you will not be fighting yourself while you face it. That is the threshold this episode opens. Not how to be coherent, but how coherence feels when participation no longer costs you. From here, we will let the field speak again. We will feel alignment before defining it. We will map coherence as physiology rather than belief. We will observe where fragmentation is rewarded and how exhaustion is mistaken for responsibility. And we will move carefully towards sovereignty, not as control, but as presence that no longer needs defense. For now, stay with the opening truth. Coherence is not something you achieve. It is what remains when you stop fragmenting to participate. Atmospheric hook. When things finally line up, there is a moment when nothing improves, and yet everything eases. No insight lands. No decision is made. No problem is solved. And still something aligns. The tension you didn't realize you were carrying loosens. The background effort drops. You notice that you are no longer translating yourself to move. That is the moment coherence becomes felt. Most people do not recognize it at first because it lacks drama. It does not arrive with relief as emotion. It arrives as the absence of interference, as the disappearance of an internal tug, as the sense that action no longer requires explanation to yourself before it can happen. Coherence does not announce itself. It does not say, "This is right." It simply stops pulling you out of time. For a long time, your nervous system learned to operate under misalignment. It learned to act faster than the signal, to decide before feeling, to move because demand arrived, not because timing matched. That misalignment became normal. You learned to live slightly ahead of yourself, carrying your body along behind your decisions like a delayed echo. So when coherence appears, it can feel strangely quiet, almost empty. There is no push, no resistance, no urgency to close the moment. Action arises, and you notice that nothing inside argues with it. This is the first felt marker of coherence, the relief of not translating yourself. Translation is the work you do when the inner signal and outer demand do not match. You translate feeling into acceptable action. You translate hesitation into productivity. You translate discomfort into compliance. You translate exhaustion into responsibility. You translate misalignment into stories about why it's fine. That translation happens internally before anyone else is involved. It is the quiet conversation you have with yourself to keep moving, and it costs more than you realize. When coherence appears, that conversation stops mid-sentence, not because you answered it, but because it is no longer needed. You do not need to convince yourself to act. You do not need to override hesitation. You do not need to justify pacing. Action and signal meet without negotiation. This does not feel exciting. It feels steady. You notice it first in timing. The speed of your thoughts matches the speed of your movement. You are not rushing ahead mentally while your body catches up. You are not dragging yourself through action while your mind resists. The internal clocks align. This is what it means for inner pacing to stop fighting outer demand. Outer demand does not disappear. The world does not slow down to accommodate you. Tasks still exist. Decisions still need to be made. But something shifts in how those demands land. They no longer hijack your timing. They either fit or they don't. When they fit, action feels clean. You move without friction. You do what needs to be done and feel present while doing it. There is no sense of loss, no aftertaste of resentment or depletion. Effort exists, but it does not fragment you. When they don't fit, the misalignment is clear immediately. You feel the pull, the internal resistance, the sense that moving now would require you to split. That clarity does not paralyze you. It informs you. This is another quiet marker of coherence. Misalignment becomes legible without escalation. Before coherence, misalignment often showed up as stress, irritability, fatigue, or avoidance. You felt off but couldn't locate why. You pushed through or shut down. You told yourself stories to make sense of it. You assumed the problem was motivation or discipline. After coherence begins to appear, misalignment shows up earlier and more precisely. You feel it as a timing mismatch rather than as emotion. You know when you are about to move out of sync with yourself. That knowledge does not force a choice. It offers one. This is why coherence feels like nothing pulling you out of time. There is no internal tug-of-war, no sense of being rushed by the world or dragged by yourself. You are in the moment you are in, doing the thing you are doing, without commentary running ahead or behind. People often expect coherence to feel like certainty, like knowing exactly what to do. But certainty is cognitive and often brittle. Coherence is rhythmic. It is about pace, not answers. When coherence is present, you may still not know what will happen. You may still face ambiguity, but ambiguity no longer fractures you. You can stay with it without rushing to resolve it. That staying is not endurance, it is alignment. Another felt marker appears in attention. Before coherence, attention is divided. Part of you is acting, part of you is monitoring, part of you is anticipating consequences, part of you is checking whether this feels right. That division creates background noise. Even when you succeed, something feels off. When coherence appears, attention gathers. You are where you are, doing what you are doing, not because you force focus, but because there is no internal disagreement pulling attention apart. This gathering of attention reduces cognitive load dramatically. You are no longer running simulations about how this should feel or where it is leading. You are simply present in the act. Presence here is not a practice. It is a byproduct of alignment. You feel this in small, ordinary moments. Responding to an email without dread, saying no without explanation, taking a break without guilt, beginning a task without resistance, ending something without justification. None of these moments feel special. They feel normal. That is the point. Coherence restores normality to participation. Normality, in this sense, is not average behavior. It is unfragmented behavior, acting without internal contradiction. Another signal of coherence is the disappearance of after effects. Before coherence, actions leave residue. You replay conversations. You second-guess decisions. You feel the need to explain yourself to someone later. You feel drained without knowing why. These after effects are signs that you acted out of time with yourself. When coherence appears, those residues fade. Not because everything went perfectly, but because nothing inside you was left behind. You were present for your own action. There is nothing to recover. This is often noticed only in retrospect. You realize that something that would normally occupy your mind simply doesn't. The absence is striking, but quiet. Coherence also changes how you relate to effort. Effort does not disappear, but it stops feeling like resistance. You can exert yourself without fighting yourself. You can face difficulty without fragmentation. The effort feels contained within the action rather than leaking into identity. This is why coherence is sustainable. It does not require constant replenishment because it does not burn energy, maintaining internal conflict. Many people mistake burnout for overwork, but burnout is more accurately the result of sustained incoherence, of acting repeatedly out of time with yourself, of translating the signal into compliance day after day. Coherence interrupts that pattern not by reducing demand, but by restoring alignment. When action matches signal, even demanding participation can be tolerable. When action contradicts signal, even small demands feel heavy. This is not a moral judgment, it is a physiological reality. As coherence settles, you may notice a subtle shift in how you speak to yourself. The internal voice quiets, not because you suppress it, but because it no longer has to manage conflict. You do not need to narrate your choices. You do not need to justify your pace. You do not need to reassure yourself constantly. This quiet is not emptiness, it is space reclaimed. In that space, decisions arise more naturally, not faster but cleaner. You may still take time, but the time is not filled with argument. It is filled with sensing. This sensing is what allows action to match the signal without effort. Effortlessness here does not mean ease. It means a lack of internal resistance. You can do hard things without splitting yourself to do them. You can say difficult things without rehearsing them into safety. You can pause without fear of falling behind. This is what coherence feels like in the body, and because this is an atmospheric hook, we do not define it yet. We do not explain it away. We let the listener recognize it if they have felt it, or sense its absence if they haven't. You do not need to remember a perfect moment. You may notice it in contrast, in moments when things did not line up and you felt the cost. That contrast is enough. Coherence feels like nothing pulling you out of time. No urgency is dragging you forward. No resistance holding you back. No internal translator running interference. Just participation that fits. As the episode continues, we will stabilize this feeling conceptually. We will map why fragmentation became normal. We will ground coherence in physiology. We will show how language, action, and environment reorganize when alignment holds. But for now, stay with the sensation. The quiet relief of not having to translate yourself. The ease of action matching signal. The sense that inner pacing is no longer fighting outer demand. That feeling is the doorway. Etymology and definition. What is coherence? Coherence is one of those words that feels self-evident until you try to live inside it. It is praised, demanded, and often moralist, yet rarely defined at the level where it actually operates. People are told to be coherent, to act coherently, to think coherently, as though coherence were a virtue you could adopt through discipline or belief. But coherence is not a moral achievement. It is a physiological condition, and when it is missing, no amount of intention can substitute for it. To stabilize the concept, we have to slow down and strip away what coherence is commonly mistaken for. We begin with the word itself. Etymologically, coherence comes from the Latin cohere, co meaning together, and herere meaning to stick, to cling, or to hold fast. The original sense is not ideological alignment or logical consistency. It is physical adhesion. Things are holding together. Parts remain connected rather than pulling apart under force. This matters immediately because coherence was never about correctness. It was about non-fragmentation. Something is coherent when its parts remain connected under movement, when stress does not cause internal separation, when motion does not tear the structure apart. This is why coherence was first used in physics and material science before it was ever moralist in psychology or culture. A coherent system transmits force without disintegrating. That meaning has been lost. In contemporary language, coherence is often confused with consistency. People assume coherence means behaving the same way everywhere, holding the same position at all times, or presenting a unified narrative across contexts. But consistency is behavioral. Coherence is structural. You can be consistent and still be incoherent. You can repeat the same pattern faithfully while splitting yourself internally to maintain it. Many people do this every day. They show up the same way at work, in relationships, in family systems, not because it fits them, but because it is expected. That consistency is often sustained by override. Coherence does not require sameness. It requires a connection between parts. This is the first distinction to stabilize. Coherence is not consistency. Consistency asks, are my actions the same across contexts? Coherence asks, are my actions connected to my internal signal as they occur? A person can change behavior across contexts and remain coherent if those changes arise from signal rather than pressure. Another person can behave identically everywhere and remain deeply incoherent if that sameness is maintained through fragmentation. The next confusion is with certainty. Certainty is cognitive closure. It is the mind arriving at an answer and locking it in place. Certainty can feel stabilizing because it reduces ambiguity, but certainty is brittle. It collapses under new information. It often requires defense, and it can exist entirely independently of bodily alignment. Many people mistake certainty for coherence because certainty feels calm, but that calm is often the calm of exclusion. Uncertainty has been pushed out. Dissonance has been silenced. An internal signal that does not fit the conclusion has been overridden. This is not coherent. It is a resolution. Coherence does not eliminate uncertainty. It allows uncertainty to exist without fragmentation. You can remain coherent while not knowing. In fact, coherence often requires not knowing, because knowing too quickly is one of the primary ways a signal gets overridden. So coherence is not certainty. The next confusion is with integrity. Integrity, like coherence, comes from a structural metaphor, from integer, whole, intact, undivided. Integrity refers to adherence to principles, values, or commitments. It is ethical, it is aspirational, and it often requires effort. Coherence is not aspirational. It is descriptive. You can act with integrity while fragmenting yourself internally. You can uphold values at great physiological cost. Many people do. They call it strength. They call it sacrifice. They call it being a good person. But their nervous systems pay the price. Integrity asks, am I acting according to what I believe? Coherence asks, is my nervous system remaining intact while I act? These questions intersect, but they are not the same. Then there is authenticity. Authenticity is often framed as expressing your true self regardless of context. It is about honesty, transparency, and self-expression. While this can overlap with coherence, it often becomes performative. People express without timing. They reveal without regulation. They speak truth without capacity, theirs or the others, to hold it. Authenticity without coherence can be destabilizing. It can fracture relationships. It can overwhelm the body. It can create conflict that feels righteous but unsustainable. Coherence does not prioritize expression. It prioritizes alignment, which brings us to the central stabilization. Coherence is alignment as rhythm, not sameness. Rhythm implies timing, pace, sequence, compatibility. Two rhythms can differ and still align. Two heartbeats do not beat identically, but they can synchronize enough to function together. Two nervous systems do not need to match exactly to be coherent. They need to be compatible in timing. This is why coherence belongs in phase 3, after reciprocity. Reciprocity revealed whether timing could be shared between systems. Coherence asks whether that shared timing can be sustained in participation. It is no longer just about contact. It is about action in the world, and this leads us to the working definition, placed now with its full weight. Coherence is the nervous system's capacity to participate in the world without fragmenting internal signals. Every element of that definition matters. Nervous system, because coherence is not a belief or an attitude. It is embodied. You feel coherence or its absence before you can explain it. Capacity, because coherence is not constant. It fluctuates. It can be present in one context and absent in another. It can be restored and lost again. It is not a permanent achievement. Participate in the world, because coherence is not about withdrawal or insulation. It is not about staying safe by staying small. It is about engagement, work, relationship, responsibility, and action, without fragmenting, because fragmentation is the core failure. Fragmentation occurs when one part of you moves while another is suppressed, ignored, or left behind. When action proceeds without a signal. When the signal is overridden to meet demand. Internal signal, because coherence does not require comfort or pleasure. Signal includes discomfort, hesitation, resistance, readiness, fatigue, excitement, and clarity. Coherence does not mean acting only when things feel good. It means acting without severing the connection to what you feel. This is why coherence is not the same as ease. You can act coherently in difficulty. You can face a challenge, exert effort, hold responsibility, and remain coherent if your action does not require you to disown the signal to proceed. You can also act incoherently in comfort. You can do easy things out of time with yourself and feel the cost later. This reframes exhaustion. Exhaustion is often attributed to workload or stress, but many people are not exhausted because they are doing too much. They are exhausted because they are doing things incoherently, acting repeatedly without internal alignment. The nervous system pays for fragmentation. This is why coherence feels relieving without being exciting. It reduces internal labor. It stops the constant negotiation between the parties. It ends the need for self-translation. Now we bring in the mirror linguistic hypothesis as a stabilizing lens rather than a framework. The mirror linguistic hypothesis proposes that language mirrors the nervous system state before it communicates meaning. When the state is fragmented, language compensates. When the state is coherent, language reflects. This is why coherence changes speech without effort. You do not need to decide to speak differently. Words shorten, tone stabilizes, explanations drop away, silence becomes usable. Language no longer carries the burden of bridging internal contradiction. This leads to the first mirror linguistic hypothesis principle for this episode. Coherence emerges after reciprocity, not before. Without reciprocity, coherence collapses under contact. You may feel aligned alone, but as soon as you enter a field that collapses time or demands adaptation, fragmentation returns. You override the signal to keep up. You translate yourself to remain legible. Reciprocity removed pressure from contact. Coherence asks whether you can now participate without splitting. The second MLH principle follows naturally. When the state is stable, language mirrors alignment. Language does not create coherence. It reveals it. When internal signal and action align, language becomes quieter, slower, and more precise. Not because you are trying to communicate better, but because there is no internal contradiction to compensate for. This is why people often mistake coherence for confidence. Confidence is behavioral assurance. It projects certainty. It often masks fragmentation. People can appear confident while overriding themselves constantly. In fact, confidence is sometimes the very thing that keeps incoherence hidden. Coherence does not project, it settles. A coherent person may appear less forceful, less decisive, less persuasive, especially in environments organized around urgency, but they are more stable. Their actions land. Their presence does not erode them over time. Confidence says, I know what I'm doing. Coherence says, I'm not splitting to do this. That distinction matters. Coherence also differs from control. Control attempts to stabilize the external world to protect the internal state. Coherence stabilizes the internal state, so the external world does not need to be controlled. This is why coherence precedes sovereignty. You cannot be sovereign while fragmented. Sovereignty without coherence becomes rigidity or withdrawal. Coherence stabilizes participation so that sovereignty does not require defense. So we close this section by returning to where we began. Coherence is not moral. It is not ideological. It is not about being right, authentic, or consistent. It is about parts staying connected while you move through the world. It is structural integrity under participation. When coherence is present, you do not feel pulled apart by what you are doing. You do not leave parts of yourself behind to meet demand. You do not need to recover from your own actions. When coherence is absent, no amount of explanation, justification, or certainty will make participation sustainable, and this is why coherence belongs here in phase 3, not as a goal to pursue, but as a condition to recognize. A condition that tells you whether your participation is viable and whether the fields you are entering can hold you without requiring you to fragment. In the next section, we will look at why fragmentation came to feel normal, why incoherence is rewarded, praised, and often mistaken for maturity, and how the nervous system learns to survive by splitting signal from action. Cognitive hook. Why fragmentation feels normal. Fragmentation feels normal because it was rewarded long before it was recognized. Not consciously, not maliciously, but consistently. From early education through professional life, from family systems to social environments, people learn that participation is measured by output, responsiveness, and reliability, not by internal alignment. Over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns to split the signal from action to survive and succeed. That split becomes so familiar that coherence feels strange, even irresponsible. This section names that adaptation without condemning it. Fragmentation is not a personal failure. It is a conditioned response to environments that collapse time. When a demand arrives faster than the signal can organize, the nervous system faces a choice: delay and risk consequence, or override and comply. Most people learn early that delay costs more, so they override. They act before feeling. They decide before sensing. They speak before the signal completes. The body follows later, if at all. This is the origin of functioning. Functioning is often praised as maturity, as resilience, as professionalism, but functioning in this sense is not coherence. It is a successful override. The nervous system becomes skilled at suppressing internal information that would slow action. Fatigue is postponed, hesitation is ignored, discomfort is reframed as weakness, intuition is discounted as unreliable. Over time, this suppression is no longer felt as suppression. It is felt as a normal operating mode. This is why incoherence rarely announces itself as a problem. It announces itself as competence. From a cognitive perspective, this adaptation is efficient in the short term. The prefrontal cortex learns to prioritize task execution over interoceptive input. Attention is directed outward. Goal completion becomes the organizing principle. Internal signals that do not directly serve task execution are deprioritized. Neuroscience describes this as top-down control dominating the bottom-up signal. Executive networks override interoceptive networks. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors error and conflict, pushing behavior toward resolution. The insular signals about bodily state are noted, but not allowed to interrupt action. In environments that reward speed and consistency, this architecture is reinforced. You are praised for meeting deadlines, not for sensing misalignment. You are rewarded for decisiveness, not for timing. You are promoted for productivity, not for coherence. Over time, the brain learns that the internal signal is optional, useful sometimes, but dispensable when inconvenient. This is the cognitive root of fragmentation. The problem is not that the brain does this. The problem is that it keeps doing it long after the original conditions have passed. The override becomes habitual. The nervous system forgets how to wait for a signal before acting. Fragmentation then stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like identity. I'm just someone who pushes through. I work best under pressure. I don't have time to feel everything. These narratives are not beliefs. They are post hoc explanations for a nervous system organized around override. This is why coherence can initially feel unsafe. When override drops, internal signals return. Fatigue becomes visible, hesitation appears, misalignment is felt, and because these signals were previously suppressed to maintain functioning, their return is misinterpreted as regression. People often say, I was better before I slowed down. What they mean is, I was more fragmented, but it was rewarded. The cognitive hook here is recognizing that what felt like strength was often suppression, and what feels like weakness now is signal returning. Social systems reinforce this confusion. Misalignment is often rewarded because it produces predictable output. A person who ignores their own timing can be counted on to respond quickly. They adapt, they fill gaps, they stabilize fields by absorbing pressure. This makes systems run smoothly, at least on the surface. Coherent people can appear disruptive in such systems. They pause. They do not respond immediately. They resist rushing decisions. They allow silence. They decline participation that would require fragmentation. This can be misread as a lack of commitment, lack of drive, or lack of professionalism. So the system subtly pressures coherence out of existence. From a social neuroscience perspective, this pressure is transmitted through cues of approval and disapproval. Faster responses receive positive feedback. Hesitation receives scrutiny. Over time, the brain associates speed with safety and delay with threat. This conditioning is not intellectual. It is embodied. The amygdala learns that waiting carries risk. The stress response is activated not by danger, but by delay. Urgency becomes a safety signal. This is critical. Urgency is often mistaken for clarity. When urgency is present, decisions feel clear because the nervous system has narrowed options to reduce threat. The prefrontal cortex collapses choice space. Ambiguity is eliminated. Action is selected quickly. This can feel decisive and even empowering. But this clarity is not coherence. It is threat-driven narrowing. True coherence allows for multiple options without fragmentation. Urgency eliminates options to protect the system. The relief people feel in urgency is often relief from uncertainty, not alignment with the signal. This is why many people seek pressure environments. Deadlines, crises, high-stakes situations. Pressure temporarily resolves internal conflict by forcing action. The cost comes later when the body catches up. Chronic exposure to this pattern leads to exhaustion. Exhaustion is not simply a lack of energy. It is the cumulative cost of acting out of time with yourself. Neuroscientifically, sustained override increases allostatic load. Stress hormones remain elevated. The nervous system stays mobilized. Recovery is postponed. Interoceptive accuracy declines. The brain becomes less sensitive to subtle internal cues, requiring stronger signals to register. This is why burnout often arrives suddenly. The system has been compensating for a long time. When compensation fails, collapse feels abrupt. People often respond to burnout by trying to rest harder or optimize recovery. But if participation remains incoherent, rest cannot repair the underlying mismatch. The nervous system returns to the same pattern, and the cycle repeats. This is the hidden cost of mistaking fragmentation for maturity. Maturity is often defined as the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. But endurance without alignment erodes capacity. It creates brittle systems that function until they don't. True maturity in this framework is the ability to participate without fragmentation, to act without severing the signal, to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing timing. That capacity is rare because it is not socially rewarded. Consider language around productivity. Push through, get it done, no excuses. These phrases celebrate override. They frame internal resistance as an obstacle to overcome rather than information to integrate. Even well-meaning advice often reinforces fragmentation. Just do it, don't overthink, trust the process. These statements bypass timing. They encourage action without sensing. From a cognitive standpoint, this bypass is efficient. From a nervous system standpoint, it is costly. Most exhaustion comes from acting out of time with yourself. This is not about doing too much. It is about doing things incoherently. Two people can have identical workloads. One remains coherent, the other burns out. The difference is not resilience. It is alignment. The coherent person acts when the signal and demand are compatible. They pause when they are not. They may do less, or they may do the same amount, but the internal cost is lower. The fragmented person acts whenever demand arrives, regardless of the signal. They rely on urgency to select behavior. They override repeatedly. Over time, the cost accumulates. This also explains why fragmentation is contagious. In fields organized around urgency, one person's speed creates pressure for others to match it. Timing collapses collectively. People adapt to keep up. Mutual regulation is replaced by mutual override. The field becomes productive and unsustainable at the same time. Coherence in such fields can feel lonely. You may be the only one pausing, the only one not rushing, the only one allowing signal. This can trigger social threat responses. The fear of exclusion or judgment pushes many people back into fragmentation. So coherence requires not just internal capacity, but discernment about where participation is viable. This is why episode 9 follows reciprocity. Without reciprocity, coherence cannot hold in contact. The field will force fragmentation again. The cognitive hook of this episode is recognizing that what felt normal was not neutral. It was conditioned, and what now feels unfamiliar is not failure. It is reorientation. Fragmentation felt normal because it was functional. It worked, until it didn't. Coherence may feel slow at first. It may feel like you are falling behind. But that sensation is often the nervous system recalibrating to a different timing reference, one that does not rely on urgency to move. As coherence stabilizes, productivity does not disappear. It changes quality. Actions become fewer but cleaner. Decisions take longer but land better. Participation costs less. This is not optimization. It is sustainability. So this section does not ask you to stop functioning. It asks you to notice what is required of you, to recognize the cost of constant override, to understand why incoherence felt like maturity and why exhaustion felt inevitable. Once you see that, coherence is no longer a luxury. It becomes a requirement for continued participation without collapse. In the next section, we will bring coherence back into the body fully. We will map how alignment feels somatically, how action arises without internal debate, and how the nervous system signals when participation is coherent versus when it is fragmenting. For now, hold the reframe gently. If you are tired, it may not be because you are weak or unmotivated. It may be because you have been acting out of time with yourself for a very long time. The somatic blueprint, how alignment feels in the body coherence, is felt before it is understood because it is not a thought process. It is a physiological state. When alignment is present, the body does not need to negotiate with itself to act. There is no internal debate to resolve, no part to silence, no signal to override. Action emerges, and the body recognizes it as its own. This section maps that recognition, not as a mindset, not as an attitude, but as a coordinated biological process involving the brain, the nervous system, and the body's continuous sensing of itself in relation to the world. The simplest way to name coherence somatically is this: the absence of internal contradiction during movement. When coherence is present, movement begins without preparatory tension. The breath does not brace ahead of action. The jaw does not tighten to push words out. The shoulders do not rise to carry responsibility prematurely. The body does not recruit unnecessary force to stabilize itself. Action arises without argument. That absence of argument is not laziness or passivity. It is coordination. From a neurobiological perspective, coherence reflects a state in which bottom-up sensory information and top-down executive processes are integrated rather than competing. The brain is not suppressing bodily signals to execute behavior, nor is bodily signal overwhelming cognition. They are moving together. This integration begins with interoception, the body's capacity to sense its internal state. Interoception is mediated primarily through the insular cortex, which integrates signals from the viscera, muscles, joints, breath, and cardiovascular system. When interoceptive signaling is accurate and accessible, the brain has a reliable internal reference for timing, readiness, and capacity. In incoherence, interoceptive input is present but deprioritized. Signals arrive, but are not allowed to influence action. Fatigue is noted but ignored. Hesitation is registered but overridden. Readiness is assumed rather than sensed. Over time, this produces what feels like decisiveness, but is actually interoceptive disconnection. Coherence restores interoceptive authority, not by amplifying sensation, but by allowing sensation to participate in decision-making. When the signal is allowed to complete before action is selected, movement feels grounded rather than forced. This is where action begins to arise without internal debate. Debate is required when parts disagree. One part pushes forward, another resists. The mind argues with the body resists the mind. That argument is costly. It consumes attention, increases cognitive load, and generates background tension. When coherence is present, the debate does not occur because the parts are not misaligned. Signal informs action early enough that no override is needed. There is nothing to argue about. This coordination shows up immediately in breath. Breath is one of the clearest markers of coherence because it reflects autonomic state directly. In incoherent action, breath often becomes shallow or held just before movement. This holding is subtle and often unnoticed, but it signals anticipatory bracing. The body prepares for internal conflict. In coherent action, breath continues. There may be effort, but breath supports it rather than resists it. Exhalation accompanies movement naturally. Inhalation occurs without interruption. There is no sense of holding oneself together. This reflects stable vagal engagement. The vagus nerve plays a central role in regulating heart rate variability, respiratory rhythm, and social engagement. When vagal tone is stable, the nervous system can mobilize for action without entering threat states. The body can exert effort while remaining regulated. In incoherence, mobilization is often driven by sympathetic activation layered on top of vagal withdrawal. The system shifts into fight or flight patterns, even for non-threatening tasks. This produces urgency, tension, and fatigue. In coherence, mobilization occurs with vagal support. The system remains socially and internally engaged while acting. This is why a coherent effort feels different from a pressured effort. It does not exhaust the same way. Posture also reflects this difference. In incoherent participation, posture often compensates for internal instability. The spine stiffens, the chest collapses or overexpands. Muscles engage to hold alignment that timing does not support. This creates chronic tension patterns that persist even at rest. In coherence, posture organizes itself dynamically. There is tone without rigidity, support without bracing. Movement flows through joints rather than being held in place. This dynamic organization reduces background tension. Background tension is the low-level muscular and neural activation that persists even when nothing is happening. It is the body staying prepared because it does not trust timing. It is vigilance turned inward. When coherence appears, background tension drops not because the world is safe, but because the body trusts its own signals. It knows it will not be forced into action prematurely. It does not need to stay on guard against itself. This trust is not cognitive. It is learned through experience. At the level of the brain, coherence is associated with reduced internal conflict signaling. Regions such as the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict and error, show less activation when actions align with internal state. There is less need to resolve contradictions because contradiction does not arise. This reduces cognitive load. Cognitive load increases when the brain must simulate, monitor, and correct behavior continuously. In coherence, simulation runs constantly. Is this right? Should I be doing this? What if I'm wrong? I'll fix it later. These thoughts are not conscious decisions. They are background processes compensating for misalignment. When coherence is present, simulation quiets, not because you are careless, but because the system is not anticipating internal backlash. There is no need to run ahead mentally, because action is supported somatically. This is why coherent action feels present. Attention is not split between doing and monitoring. You are where you are. Neuroception plays a critical role here. Neuroception, a term describing the nervous system's unconscious detection of safety or threat, operates continuously. It assesses internal and external cues to determine whether mobilization, shutdown, or engagement is appropriate. In incoherence, neuroception often flags internal threat. The body detects a contradiction between signal and action and interprets it as danger. This triggers stress responses even when the external environment is benign. In coherence, neuroception registers internal safety. The body senses that the action is not a violating signal. There is no need to escalate. This allows the nervous system to remain flexible rather than defensive. This internal safety is foundational. Without it, no amount of cognitive reframing can create coherence. Psychologically, coherence is often mistaken for motivation or clarity. But motivation is often a response to pressure, and clarity is often a byproduct of urgency. Coherence is quieter. It is the feeling that nothing inside is being dragged forward or held back. This feeling can be subtle, especially at first. Many people have lived in incoherence for so long that tension feels like normal engagement. When tension drops, it can feel like emptiness or a lack of drive. This is not an absence, it is recalibration. The nervous system is learning a new baseline. This recalibration takes time because the body has learned to associate urgency with safety. Slowing down can initially trigger anxiety, not because something is wrong, but because the system is unused to moving at its own pace. Coherence requires tolerance of that unfamiliar quiet. As coherence stabilizes, action begins to feel self-propelling rather than forced. You do not need to psych yourself up. You do not need to push. You simply move when the timing is right. This is not mystical, it is biological. The body is an anticipatory system. When allowed to integrate the signal, it prepares the action automatically. Muscles engage in sequence, breath adjusts, attention orients. There is no need for conscious command. In incoherence, this automatic preparation is interrupted. Action is initiated cognitively before the body is ready. The body then scrambles to catch up, creating strain. Coherence restores the natural sequence. This restoration also changes how rest is experienced. In incoherence, rest often feels insufficient. You stop moving, but tension remains. The body does not fully downregulate because it expects to be overridden again. Rest becomes shallow. In coherence, rest deepens. Because the body trusts that action will not be forced, it allows itself to settle fully. Recovery improves not because you rest more, but because rest is not undermined by anticipation of override. This has long-term effects on health. Chronic incoherence contributes to dysregulation across systems, sleep disturbance, digestive issues, immune suppression, and chronic pain. These are not separate problems. They are downstream effects of sustained internal conflict. Coherence does not cure illness, but it reduces the load that exacerbates it. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, coherence also reorganizes language at the somatic level. When the body does not have to argue with itself, language no longer carries compensatory weight. Words do not need to justify action or soothe internal resistance. Speech becomes a reflection of the state rather than a tool for regulation. Tone stabilizes, pace slows, pauses appear naturally. Silence becomes inhabitable. This is not because you decide to speak differently. It is because there is no internal urgency to manage. Mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory extends this understanding into interaction. When one person is coherent, their timing influences the field, not by control but by stability. Others may entrain to that timing if their systems allow it. If not, misalignment becomes visible. This visibility is not confrontational. It is informative. Coherence, then, is not just an internal experience. It is a field event. It changes how participation unfolds around you, but it does not require you to manage that change. The body leads. This returns us to the key line, now grounded fully in physiology. Coherence is when the body doesn't have to argue with itself. No debate, no override, no compensation. Just movement that fits. As this episode continues, coherence will move from body to participation, from felt alignment to sustained engagement, from internal integrity to external presence. But here, in the somatic blueprint, the foundation is laid. Alignment is not a concept, it is a state that can be recognized, lost, and restored, and once recognized, it becomes difficult to ignore the cost of its absence. That recognition is not a demand, it is an invitation. Field case study, participating without splitting this case study, is not about success, it is about relief. The kind of relief that arrives not because circumstances improved, but because internal division stopped being required in order to participate. The setting is ordinary, a role, a workplace, a recurring environment where expectations are clear, timelines are tight, and participation has historically required adaptation. Nothing extreme, no overt threat, just a steady pressure to be legible, responsive, and composed. For years, participation here depended on masking. Masking did not mean deception. It meant translation, adjusting tone, modulating pace, editing responses, anticipating how things would land, carrying a version of yourself that fits the environment, even when it does not fully fit you. The cost was subtle at first, a mild tension, a sense of effort, a need to decompress afterwards. Over time, that cost accumulated. Before coherence, this environment demanded splitting. One part of the system handled execution, another monitored perception, another suppressed signal that would slow things down. Fatigue was normalized, irritability was managed quietly, discomfort was reframed as professionalism. From the outside, participation looked competent, even calm. Internally, it was fragmented. The moment coherence begins to stabilize, this environment becomes a test case. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because the usual strategies no longer activate automatically. The system no longer defaults to masking. Not as an act of defiance, but because the body no longer offers it as the easiest option. The first change is subtle, response timing shifts. Previously, responses arrived quickly, not necessarily rushed, but early, often before the signal fully formed. The body had learned that delay increased pressure, so it preempted, spoke early, clarified quickly, explained before being asked. Now responses arrive later, not because of intention, because the signal takes precedence. The body waits long enough to feel what is actually present before language forms. This waiting does not feel dramatic. It feels normal, but it is noticeable in contrast. The environment does not collapse. No one reacts negatively. The feared consequences do not arrive. This is important. Coherence often reveals that some of the pressure was internalized long after it stopped being enforced. The next shift appears in tone. Previously, tone was managed, softened, neutralized, adjusted to maintain smoothness. This management happened automatically. A layer of performance that ensured acceptability. Now tone reflects state, not blunt, not careless, just unedited. There is less modulation, less smoothing, less effort to sound a certain way. The voice carries presence rather than calibration. This feels risky at first. The old system equated modulation with safety. But again, the field holds. Nothing breaks. This is where participation without performance begins. Performance is not loud or dramatic. Often it is quiet, polite, professional. Performance is the extra layer added to ensure reception. It is a language shaped to manage perception rather than reflect a signal. In this case, performance drops not because of a decision, but because it is no longer needed to stabilize the system. The body does not ask for it. The signal is sufficient. The third shift occurs around the explanation. Before coherence, explanation was a primary tool. Not because the person over-explained habitually, but because the explanation bridged the gap between signal and action. It made misalignment tolerable. It reassured others. It reassured the self. Now explanation recedes. Actions are taken without justification. Decisions are stated without defense. Boundaries are named without narrative. Not abruptly, cleanly. This is alignment without explanation. The environment responds differently than expected. Questions still arise, but they are informational rather than corrective. There is less pushback than anticipated. it becomes clear that much of the previous explanation was compensating for internal discomfort rather than external demand. This recognition is destabilizing in a good way. It reveals how much energy was spent managing perception unnecessarily. The most significant shift, however, happens internally. Staying present becomes possible. Before coherence, presence during participation was partial. Attention was divided. One part tracked the task, another tracked the room, another monitored self-presentation. This division was exhausting but familiar. Now attention gathers. There is less self-monitoring, less scanning for reaction, less anticipation of correction. The person is in the interaction rather than above it. This is stability without withdrawal. Withdrawal would have been the old alternative. If masking became too costly, disengagement would follow. Pulling back, minimizing participation, protecting energy by absence. Coherence offers a third option, staying present without splitting. Presence here does not mean intensity or emotional openness. It means being there with a full signal intact, not braced, not defended, not collapsed. This is the key difference. As days pass, something else becomes apparent. Fatigue patterns change. Previously, participation required recovery. After meetings, after interactions, after days of sustained engagement, there was a need to decompress, to be alone, to drop the mask. Now that need diminishes. Not because the work is easier, but because less energy is spent holding internal contradictions. The nervous system does not have to recover from itself. This is one of the clearest indicators of coherence in practice. Recovery time shortens, not because stress is absent, but because fragmentation is reduced. Importantly, this does not make the person immune to pressure. There are still moments of demand that exceed capacity. There are still environments that collapse timing. In those moments, coherence wavers. But the difference now is recognition. When coherence drops, it is felt immediately as tension or effort. The system knows when it is splitting. That knowledge allows for adjustment. Sometimes that adjustment is a boundary. Sometimes it is pacing. Sometimes it is stepping back. The response is informed rather than automatic. This case study also reveals something important about identity. Many people believe they are their coping strategies. I'm just someone who adapts. I'm good at managing rooms. I know how to fit in. These identities often form around successful fragmentation. When coherence stabilizes, these identities loosen, not because they were false, but because they were context-specific adaptations. The person realizes they can participate without those strategies. This can feel disorienting. If you are no longer the one who smooths, explains, adapts, who are you in the field? The answer is quieter than expected. You are simply present. Presence does not require a role. It does not perform a function. It does not manage outcomes. It allows interaction to unfold without interference. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory perspective, this changes the field itself. When someone participates without splitting, their timing becomes more stable. Their language reflects the state rather than compensating for it. Their pauses are not performative. Their responses are not preemptive. This stability influences others. Some will entrain. They slow down. They respond more cleanly. Mutual regulation becomes possible. Others will feel unsettled. The lack of adaptation removes a familiar buffer. They may increase pressure to restore the old dynamic. Coherence does not prevent this. It reveals it. In this case study, both responses appear. In some interactions, reciprocity deepens. Conversations become more efficient. Less is said, more is understood. In others, tension increases. The absence of performance is interpreted as withdrawal or resistance. The key difference now is that the person does not correct for this tension automatically. They do not rush to reassure. They do not over-explain. They allow the field to show whether it can hold coherence. This is not indifference. It is discernment. Participation without splitting requires accepting that not all fields are compatible with coherence. Some environments depend on fragmentation to function. Recognizing this is not failure. It is information. In this case, the person adjusts participation accordingly. They remain engaged where coherence holds. They limit exposure where it doesn't. They stop forcing alignment where timing is incompatible. This is the maturation of coherence. Not rigid withdrawal, not over-adaptation, selective participation. The final reframe becomes clear through lived experience. Participation without performance means you stop adding layers to be acceptable. Alignment without explanation means your actions no longer need justification to feel legitimate. Stability without withdrawal means you remain present without disappearing or defending. None of this required confrontation. None of it required self-assertion. It required coherence to be felt and trusted. This case study does not end with transformation. It ends with sustainability. The person continues in the role. They continue to participate. But the cost has changed. The body no longer pays in fragmentation. Presence is no longer rented through performance. That is what coherence looks like in the field. Not dramatic, not idealized, just quieter, steadier participation that no longer requires leaving parts of yourself behind. Language and coherence. When words match, action language is often the last place coherence shows up, and the first place incoherence is hidden. People learn early how to speak around misalignment, how to explain themselves into legitimacy, how to justify actions that did not arise from a signal, how to smooth over the internal split between what they feel and what they do. Over time, this linguistic compensation becomes so practiced that it feels like communication itself. This section names what happens when that compensation is no longer required. When coherence stabilizes, language does not improve in the way people expect. It does not become more persuasive, more articulate, or more refined. It becomes truer to timing. Words begin to arrive where action already is, rather than racing ahead of it, or lagging behind it. This is what it means for words to match action. Before coherence, language is often recruited to repair misalignment. Action happens too early, too late, or against signal, and language rushes in afterwards to make it make sense. Explanation fills the gap. Narratives are built to stabilize identity and reassure others. Tone is managed to offset internal discomfort. This is not manipulation, it is compensation. Compensation is necessary when action and signal are out of sync. Language becomes the glue holding fragmented participation together. It patches over internal contradictions so that behavior can continue without collapse. When coherence appears, that glue is no longer needed. This is why one of the first noticeable changes is a reduction in explanation, not because the person withholds information, not because they are evasive, but because the explanation was doing work that no longer exists. It was compensating for misalignment. Once alignment is present, explanation becomes optional rather than compulsory. This can feel disorienting. Many people equate explanation with responsibility. They believe that if they do not explain, they are being careless, unaccountable, or dismissive. But much of what is called responsibility is actually linguistic labor performed to offset internal uncertainty. When you are unsure of your own action, you explain more. When you are coherent, explanation becomes redundant. This is the first behavioral marker of coherence in language. Fewer words, not as a restraint, but as accuracy. Accuracy here does not mean factual precision. It means state fidelity. The words that are spoken correspond directly to the action being taken. Nothing extra is added to stabilize perception. Nothing is removed to avoid reaction. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this shift is foundational. The mirror linguistic hypothesis proposes that language mirrors the nervous system's state before it transmits content. When the state is fragmented, language compensates. When the state is coherent, language reflects. Reflection is quieter than compensation. Compensatory language is busy. It clarifies preemptively. It reassures continuously. It anticipates misunderstanding. It tries to land safely before being questioned. Reflective language waits. It arrives after action has already been selected somatically. It does not need to persuade the speaker or the listener. It simply marks what is happening. This is why coherent speech often sounds less impressive. It lacks rhetorical flourish. It does not argue. It does not perform conviction. It does not sell itself. It does not need to. Another shift occurs in decision language. Before coherence, decisions are often wrapped in justification. I decided this because, the reason I'm doing this is, I had to choose this because, these explanations are not always for others. They are often for the self. Decision-making under incoherence requires narrative support. The story helps carry the decision forward when the signal is absent or contradictory. When coherence is present, decisions arrive cleanly. They may still be explained if context requires it, but explanation is not required for legitimacy. The decision feels complete without a narrative. This produces what might be called decision quiet. Decision quiet is the absence of internal reverberation after a choice. You do not replay it. You do not rehearse defending it. You do not imagine future conversations where you justify it again. The nervous system recognizes the decision as aligned, and so it settles. This is not certainty. It is a resolution at the somatic level. Language follows that resolution. Another important shift is how questions are asked and answered. In incoherence, questions often serve to manage uncertainty rather than gather information. People ask to reassure themselves, to test safety, to buy time, to avoid committing. These questions are linguistically framed as curiosity, but function as regulation. In coherence, questions become cleaner. They are asked when information is actually needed, not when anxiety needs soothing. They arrive without urgency. They do not collapse at the moment. Similarly, answers change. Before coherence, answers are often layered. They include context, rationale, reassurance, and preemption. They aim to close the loop decisively. After coherence, answers are simpler. They may even feel incomplete by old standards, but they are complete at the level of signal. The body does not need to add more. This simplicity can be misinterpreted. Others may ask, is that all? Not because more is needed, but because they are accustomed to language doing more work. The absence of compensation can feel like the absence of care. This is a key friction point. Coherence removes contradiction, but not everyone is organized around coherence. Some fields rely on explanation to function. When the explanation drops, the field may destabilize temporarily. From an MLH field theory perspective, this is expected. Language does not exist in isolation. It entrains relational timing. When one person stops compensating linguistically, the field loses a stabilizing element it had come to rely on. This can reveal underlying misalignment. Coherence does not fix that misalignment. It reveals it. This is why coherence can feel risky in relational contexts, not because it is wrong, but because it removes a buffer. But the removal of that buffer is precisely what restores language to its proper function. Language is not meant to manage nervous systems. It is meant to express meaning once regulation is already present. When language is used to manage regulation, it becomes distorted. Tone becomes strategic. Pace becomes defensive. Words are chosen for effect rather than accuracy. When regulation is restored, language relaxes. This relaxation shows up in pacing. Speech slows, not artificially, but organically. Pauses appear without discomfort. Silence is allowed to complete. There is no rush to fill gaps. This pacing reflects coherence in timing. The nervous system is no longer outrunning itself. Prosody changes as well. Intonation flattens slightly, not into monotony, but into steadiness. Emotional spikes are less pronounced because they are no longer compensating for internal conflict. This does not make speech dull, it makes it trustworthy. Trustworthiness in language comes from consistency between state and expression, not from emotional intensity. Another critical shift appears in disagreement. Before coherence, disagreement often triggers linguistic escalation. Explanations expand, defenses appear, identity is invoked. The conversation becomes about proving alignment rather than exploring difference. After coherence, disagreement can remain local. It does not spread through the system. Language stays close to the specific point of difference. There is no need to defend the whole self. This is because coherence stabilizes identity implicitly. You do not need to protect your sense of self through language when your nervous system is not fragmenting. Disagreement becomes information rather than a threat. This changes how boundaries are expressed linguistically. Before coherence, boundaries often come with justification. I can't do this because, I need to say no because. The explanation softens the boundary and protects against perceived rejection. After coherence, boundaries can be named simply. I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I'm not going to do that. These statements are not aggressive. They are complete. Completeness is another hallmark of coherent language. A complete statement does not invite negotiation unless negotiation is desired. It does not trail off. It does not seek validation. It stands. Standing does not require force when coherence is present. This brings us to the key insight of this section, now grounded fully in behavior and field dynamics. Coherence restores language by removing contradiction. Contradiction is what distorts language. When action contradicts signal, language compensates. When the signal contradicts the action, language repairs. When intention contradicts capacity, language negotiates. Remove contradiction, and language settles. This restoration is not an upgrade. It is a return. Children speak coherently before they learn to compensate. Their language reflects the state directly. Over time, socialization teaches them to override signals and use language to manage their response. Coherence is lost, not because language matures, but because participation demands it. Coherence restores something pre-verbal, the alignment between feeling, timing, and expression. From a neuropsychological perspective, this restoration reduces load on executive function. The brain no longer has to coordinate competing internal signals through narrative. Working memory is freed. Attention stabilizes. This has practical effects. People report less mental fatigue after conversations, less need to replay interactions, less rumination, less self-critique. These are not signs of disengagement. They are signs of alignment. Language becomes a tool again, rather than a crutch. Importantly, this does not mean language becomes minimal everywhere. Coherent language can still be rich, expressive, and complex, but its complexity serves a meaning rather than compensation. You may still explain when context requires it. You may still elaborate when teaching or storytelling. The difference is that explanation is chosen, not required to stabilize action. This choice restores agency to language. Agency here is not in control over others. It is freedom from compulsion. The freedom not to speak when silence is sufficient. The freedom not to explain when the action is complete. The freedom to speak simply without padding. This freedom can feel stark at first. People may comment that you seem different, quieter, more direct, less expressive. These observations are often projections of their own reliance on compensatory language. Coherence does not require you to correct those perceptions. It allows them to exist. This is where language and sovereignty begin to intersect. But sovereignty comes next. For now, coherence is enough. As we move toward the closing sections of this episode, the emphasis will shift from explanation to observation again, from naming changes to recognizing them as they occur, from understanding coherence to living inside it without narrating it. Because the ultimate sign of coherence in language is this: you stop talking about coherence. You stop explaining why you are aligned. You stop justifying your pacing. You stop narrating your internal state. You simply act, and when you speak, your words land where your actions already are. That is when language has returned to its proper place. Not as manager, not as a defender, not as a repair mechanism, but as a reflection. That is what coherence gives back to language, when contradiction no longer needs to be carried. Observation practice, noticing alignment versus drift. This section is not a practice you perform. It is a way of noticing what is already happening without interfering with it. The moment observation becomes correction, coherence collapses back into management. So the instruction here is deliberately restrained. Awareness without optimization. Recognition without response. The object of observation is not behavior. It is alignment. Alignment is felt as cleanliness in action. Drift is felt as residue afterwards. You do not need to search for either. They announce themselves if you are not trying to change them. The first invitation is simple. Notice when action feels clean. Clean action has a specific quality. It does not mean easy. It does not mean successful. It means internally complete. When you act cleanly, there is no sense of something lagging behind you. No internal voice saying, "I'll deal with that later." No tightening that signals you moved too early or stayed too long. Clean action often feels unremarkable. That is why it is missed. There is no adrenaline, no relief spike, no crash afterwards. You do the thing, and the body settles. Attention returns naturally. The nervous system does not stay activated. Notice these moments without praising them. Praise the recruit's performance. Simply register that the action did not cost you. Then notice when the explanation follows the action. Explanation is not wrong, but its timing is diagnostic. When explanation follows action compulsively, it often signals misalignment. The action may have been necessary, but the nervous system did not fully endorse it. Language steps in to stabilize what the signal could not. You might notice yourself replaying a decision and rehearsing how you would explain it if asked. You might find yourself clarifying something no one questioned. You might feel the urge to justify pacing, tone, or choice to an imagined audience. Do not suppress this. Suppression is another form of management. Just notice that the explanation arrived. Ask nothing of it. Explanation is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the system is trying to reconcile something. That reconciliation deserves attention, not correction. Next, notice when exhaustion signals misalignment. Exhaustion is often interpreted as a lack of capacity or overwork. But in this arc, exhaustion is reframed as a timing signal. It tells you that action occurred without alignment, or for too long without recalibration. This exhaustion may appear immediately or later. Sometimes you feel fine during participation and depleted afterwards. Sometimes fatigue builds quietly over days. Sometimes it shows up as irritability, fog, or a desire to withdraw. Again, do not analyze this. Do not trace it back to causes. Simply notice the pattern, action, then residue. Residue is the key word. Clean action leaves little residue. Incoherent action leaves residue that requires recovery. The body asks for rest not because effort was high, but because an internal contradiction was carried. This noticing is not meant to make you act differently. It is meant to restore signal literacy. Literacy here means the ability to recognize the difference between alignment and drift without judging either. Alignment is not superior. Drift is not failure. They are states. When you stop correcting, something important happens neurologically. The executive system, responsible for planning, monitoring, and correcting, reduces its load. It does not have to stay online constantly. This reduction frees resources for sensing and integration. Neuroscience shows that when action aligns with an internal signal, executive control can step back. The brain does not need to simulate outcomes excessively. Working memory is not occupied with self-monitoring. Attention can remain present. This is experienced subjectively as ease without effort. In contrast, when action is incoherent, executive load increases. The brain compensates by monitoring, predicting, and adjusting. This compensation is energy-intensive. It produces fatigue even in low-demand situations. Noticing alignment versus drift allows the nervous system to learn this distinction experientially rather than conceptually. That learning is neuroplastic. When you notice clean action and do nothing with it, the system registers safety in alignment. When you notice residue and do nothing with it, the system registers that signal as allowed. Over time, the nervous system begins to prefer alignment, not because you force it to, but because it costs less. This is critical. Coherence emerges when correction stops. Correction keeps the system in override. It sends the message that the signal is insufficient and must be managed. Observation sends the opposite message. The signal is trustworthy enough to be noticed. This is why the rule is strict. No correcting, no optimizing, just noticing alignment. Optimization is especially seductive. Once you feel coherence, the mind wants to replicate it, to engineer conditions, to avoid drift. But optimization collapses timing again. It introduces urgency and performance. Coherence cannot be optimized. It can only be recognized and allowed. As you observe, you may notice a subtle shift in your relationship to time. Moments stretch slightly, not because things slow down, but because you are not ahead of yourself. You are not preparing explanations in advance. You are not rehearsing responses. You are not bracing for impact that has not arrived. This presence is not effortful. It is the byproduct of reduced internal contradiction. You may also notice discomfort with this reduction. The mind may look for something to do, for something to fix. This discomfort is normal. It reflects how accustomed the system is to management. Let the discomfort exist without giving it a task. Over time, you may notice that decisions begin to feel cleaner without trying. Those explanations shorten on their own. Those exhaustion patterns shift. That rest becomes deeper. None of this needs to be pursued. The observation practice is not about becoming more coherent. It is about recognizing when coherence is present and when it is not, without intervening. This recognition restores choice later, but not now. For now, awareness is enough. Notice when action feels clean. Notice when the explanation follows the action. Notice when exhaustion signals misalignment, and then leave it there. Alignment does not need applause. Drift does not need correction. Both are information. And information, when allowed, reorganizes systems more effectively than effort ever could. This is how coherence stabilizes without becoming another performance. Self-reflection prompts gentle internal contact. This is not a question to answer. It is a question to let land. Where do I act out of time with myself? Do not search for examples. Do not scan your life for evidence. Let the body respond first. Notice any immediate sensation, a tightening, a pull, a softening, a pause. That sensation is the response. Words may come later, or not at all. Acting out of time does not always look dramatic. It can be subtle. It can appear as efficiency, as reliability, as the one who responds quickly. It can appear as pushing through mild resistance, doing something just to get it done, as staying a little longer than you meant to. Notice where the question creates friction. Notice where it creates relief. Both are information. If the mind begins to explain, let it pass. Explanation is familiar. It tries to stabilize uncertainty. You do not need it here. This reflection is not about making sense. It is about recognizing rhythm. When you act out of time, the body often knows before you do. Breathing may shorten, muscles may brace, attention may be split. You may feel slightly ahead of yourself or slightly behind. These are not failures. They are signals. You are not being asked to stop acting out of time. That would turn this into a task. You are only being asked to notice where it happens. Notice without judgment. Notice without urgency. Notice without planning what to do next. This question does not require completion. It may echo throughout the day. It may surface in small moments. It may not surface at all. All of this is acceptable. The value of this reflection is not insight. It is permission. Permission for the signal to register. Permission for timing to be felt. Permission for alignment and misalignment to coexist without correction. Stay with the question only as long as it remains gentle. When it tightens, let it go. There is nothing to solve here. Recognition is enough. Integration coherence is not certainty. Coherence is often mistaken for certainty because certainty looks organized. It sounds decisive. It presents as confidence. It reassures others. And in a world that rewards speed and clarity, certainty is easily confused with alignment. But certainty is a mental state. Coherence is a physiological one. This section exists to separate them cleanly, not conceptually, but somatically. Because when coherence is confused with certainty, people try to decide their way into alignment. They choose positions, beliefs, identities, values, and narratives, hoping that commitment will stabilize them. When it doesn't, they assume they chose wrong or didn't commit hard enough. That loop keeps coherence out of reach. So we begin with the central clarification. Coherence is not something you arrive at by thinking more clearly. It is something that emerges when the internal signal and external action stop contradicting each other. This is why coherence often appears when decision-making slows, not when it accelerates. Certainty collapses ambiguity. Coherence tolerates it. Certainty narrows options to reduce discomfort. Coherence widens the timing to allow the signal to complete. The relief people feel in certainty is often relief from not having to wait. But waiting is precisely what coherence requires. So the first reframe holds: coherence versus confidence. Confidence is behavioral assurance. It projects steadiness outward. It convinces, it reassures, it signals capability. Confidence can be useful. It can stabilize situations. But it is often built on suppression. Many confident people are internally fragmented. They speak clearly while overriding fatigue. They act decisively while ignoring hesitation. They move forward because stopping would reveal misalignment. Their confidence works until it doesn't. Coherence does not project steadiness. It is steady internally. It does not need to convince others because it is not managing doubt inside. It may look quieter, less forceful, less persuasive, especially in environments that reward assertiveness. But coherence holds under pressure differently. It does not collapse when questioned. It does not escalate when challenged. It does not require reinforcement. Confidence often needs maintenance. Coherence does not. This is why coherent people can appear uncertain without destabilizing. They can say "I don't know" without losing ground. Their nervous system remains intact even when answers are not available. The second reframe follows: coherence versus consistency. Consistency is behavioral repetition. It asks whether actions match across time and context. It is often valued as reliability, integrity, and trustworthiness. But consistency can be achieved through rigidity as easily as through alignment. Many people maintain consistency by ignoring the signal. They show up the same way because deviation feels unsafe. They suppress fluctuation to remain legible. Over time, that suppression creates fragmentation. Coherence allows variation. You can respond differently in different contexts and remain coherent if those responses arise from signal rather than pressure. You can change your mind, adjust pace, shift position. None of this threatens coherence as long as the internal signal remains connected to action. In fact, coherence often requires inconsistency because signal changes, capacity fluctuates, timing shifts. Coherence honors that movement rather than flattening it. This is why coherent participation feels alive rather than fixed. It adapts without erasing itself. The third reframe deepens the distinction: coherence versus conviction. Conviction is a belief held with force. It is certainly reinforced by identity. Conviction often carries moral weight. It can inspire, it can mobilize, but it can also override the signal. People often act against their own capacity in the name of conviction. They push past exhaustion, they ignore hesitation, they suppress doubt. They frame this as commitment, as dedication, as a strength. But conviction does not protect coherence. In fact, it often undermines it by prioritizing belief over signal. Coherence does not require belief at all. You can be coherent without knowing what you stand for in an abstract sense. You can act coherently while questioning your own assumptions. You can remain aligned without having a fixed narrative. This is deeply unsettling in cultures that equate conviction with character, but it is necessary. Conviction can be loud. Coherence is quiet. Conviction defends. Coherence listens. Conviction demands action to prove itself. Coherence allows action to arise when timing fits. This brings us to the fourth reframe: coherence versus moral clarity. Moral clarity is often praised as knowing right from wrong. It provides orientation. It reduces complexity. It allows decisive action, but moral clarity can be achieved through simplification that ignores internal conflict. People often override themselves in the name of what is right. They act against their own signal because the cause feels justified. They suppress doubt to avoid appearing weak. They push through misalignment because stopping would challenge identity. This is not coherent. It is a moral override. Coherence does not replace ethics, but it refuses to sacrifice internal integrity for external righteousness. It insists that action taken at the cost of fragmentation is not sustainable, regardless of intent. This does not mean coherent people lack values. It means values are embodied rather than imposed. They are felt through alignment rather than enforced through pressure. Coherence does not simplify morality. It complicates it in a grounded way. All of these reframes converge on the same core truth. Coherence cannot be decided into existence. This is why the core line belongs here, placed plainly and without embellishment. You don't become coherent by deciding. You become coherent by aligning. Alignment is not a choice in the conventional sense. You cannot choose to be aligned any more than you can choose to digest food faster. Alignment occurs when conditions allow signal and action to move together. Those conditions include timing tolerance, interoceptive access, reduced urgency, and environments that do not punish pause. When these conditions are present, coherence emerges. When they are not, coherence collapses regardless of intention. This is why trying to be coherent often fails. The effort itself introduces urgency. Urgency collapses timing. Timing collapse forces override. Override the fragment signal. System ends up less coherent than before. Coherence appears when effort relaxes enough for the signal to participate. This does not mean passivity. It means responsiveness without force. In practice, this integration changes how you relate to decisions. Instead of asking, what should I do, you begin to notice what is ready to happen. Instead of forcing clarity, you allow alignment to form. Instead of committing to positions, you commit to signal integrity. This may look indecisive from the outside, but internally, it is stabilizing. As coherence deepens, decisions become less dramatic. You stop framing choices as defining moments. They become movements in rhythm. Some small, some large, all grounded. You may still decide quickly at times. Speed is not the enemy. Speed without alignment is. Coherence allows both speed and slowness, depending on timing. This integration also changes how you evaluate yourself. You stop measuring success by output alone. You begin to notice the cost. You begin to recognize when participation erodes you, even if it looks good externally. This recognition is not a call to withdraw from life. It is a call to participate differently. Coherence is not a retreat. It is a refinement of engagement, and it prepares the ground for the final movement of this volume. Because once coherence stabilizes, something else becomes possible: presence without defense, participation without self-protection, sovereignty that does not require separation. But sovereignty cannot be forced. It emerges from coherence the way coherence emerges from reciprocity. So this integration closes not with instruction, but with orientation. If you are seeking certainty, coherence will frustrate you. If you are seeking confidence, coherence will quiet you. If you are seeking moral clarity, coherence will slow you down. But if you are seeking sustainability, the ability to live, act, and participate without splitting yourself, coherence will feel like coming home to timing, not decided but aligned. Coherence stabilizes participation. That is what this episode has been establishing at every level: somatic, cognitive, linguistic, and relational. When internal signal and external action move together, participation stops eroding you. You no longer have to translate yourself to move. You no longer have to justify pacing. You no longer have to bear the cost of your own actions afterwards. But coherence on its own is not the final movement. Coherence allows you to participate without splitting. Sovereignty asks a different question. What happens when participation no longer requires defense? This is the threshold we are crossing now. Many people assume sovereignty means independence, separation, or dominance, a hardened boundary, a fortified self, the capacity to stand alone. But sovereignty, as it appears here, is not built through isolation or control. It is built through stability. When coherence stabilizes participation, something subtle shifts. You stop bracing against misalignment because you can feel it early. You stop over-explaining because the action no longer contradicts the signal. You stop scanning for threats because your nervous system trusts its own timing, and when that trust is present, defense becomes unnecessary. Defense is only required when alignment feels fragile. Most people protect their alignment aggressively because it is not actually stable. They defend boundaries because they do not trust their capacity to hold a signal under pressure. They justify choices because they fear collapse if challenged. They withdraw to preserve coherence because participation would require fragmentation. This is not sovereignty. It is protection. Sovereignty emerges when alignment no longer needs to be protected. That is the bridge from episode 9 to episode 10. Coherence creates internal stability. Sovereignty removes the need to manage the world around that stability. This does not mean the world stops applying pressure. It means pressure no longer reorganizes you. When sovereignty begins to appear, presence changes quality. You are still responsive, still engaged, still affected, but you are no longer oriented around defending your internal state. You do not preemptively harden. You do not brace against intrusion. You do not disappear to stay intact. Presence becomes self-supporting. This is what presence without defense actually means. It does not mean openness without boundaries. Boundaries remain, but they are not held tensely. They are felt rather than enforced. They arise when needed and relax when not. It does not mean vulnerability as exposure. Exposure still requires context. Sovereignty does not make you careless. It makes you uncoercible. This distinction matters. A defended system is reactive. It is organized around preventing harm. A sovereign system is responsive. It is organized around maintaining integrity without force. Integrity here is not moral, it is structural. Parts remain connected under contact. Sovereignty is what happens when coherence is strong enough that you do not need to announce it, prove it, or protect it. Language shifts again here, but even more quietly. You stop explaining, not because you withhold, but because explanation would be redundant. You stop justifying not because you resist accountability, but because your actions already make sense to your body. Presence without justification does not mean silence. It means speech is no longer defensive. Words do not arrive to protect alignment. They arrive when meaning wants to move. This is why sovereignty is often misread as indifference. People accustomed to defensive signaling expect reassurance, modulation, and narrative. When those disappear, they may project withdrawal or arrogance. But sovereignty is neither. It is simply the absence of an internal threat. This absence allows you to stay present in situations that once required armor. You can remain in disagreement without escalation. You can be misunderstood without panic. You can be seen without performing. You can be alone without collapsing. None of this requires assertion. Assertion is often mistaken for sovereignty, but assertion is usually compensatory. It appears when alignment feels at risk. Sovereignty does not need to assert itself. It holds. This holding is not rigid. It is flexible and grounded. As we move into episode 10, the focus will not be on strengthening the self against the world. It will be on recognizing what happens when the self no longer needs to be protected from participation. Sovereignty is not separation. It is non-fragmenting under contact, and it is only possible because coherence has already stabilized in the nervous system. Without coherence, sovereignty becomes either withdrawal or dominance. With coherence, sovereignty becomes presence. This is the final arc of Volume 3. Stillness returned sensation. Sensation restored orientation. Orientation enabled discernment. Discernment allowed the boundary. Boundary made the voice safe. Voice restored agency. Agency revealed reciprocity. Reciprocity enabled coherence. Coherence now prepares sovereignty. Sovereignty will not be taught. It will be recognized. Recognized in moments where you remain intact without effort, where you do not need to explain yourself for safety, where you do not harden to stay present, where participation no longer threatens your internal organization. That recognition is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost anticlimactic. The nervous system simply realizes it is no longer under threat from contact itself. Next episode, episode 10, Sovereignty, Presence Without Defense. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to The Resonance Matrix, Volume 3, The Silencing Field, Return to Self, Episode 9, Coherence, Inner and Outer Alignment. I'm James Miller.